"It was my wife. She taught her a lesson." Those were the words that came out of a grown man's mouth as his 65-year-old mother stood in front of her entire family with her broken arm held up by a makeshift sling made from her own belt. The room went dead silent. His wife Sarah just smirked. But what happened next when his uncle stepped forward will absolutely shock you. Welcome back to Auntie Dorothy's Stories. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Your support truly encourages me to continue sharing these incredible tales with you. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love hearing from my sweethearts around the world. Let me take you back to that morning. Margaret had been preparing for her 65th birthday party for weeks. This wasn't just any birthday. It was supposed to be a milestone celebration, a chance to gather with family she hadn't seen in months. She'd spent what little money she had on decorations, food, and a small cake, all while struggling to do everything with one good arm. You see, Margaret's other arm was broken, hanging useless, and supported only by a leather belt she'd fashioned into a crude sling. She couldn't afford proper medical care, couldn't afford a real cast or even a doctor's visit. The belt was her only option, and it kept slipping every time she moved. But she was determined to make this party perfect for her family. The guests started arriving around 1 o'clock. Her apartment, which usually felt empty and quiet since her husband died 5 years ago, suddenly came alive with voices and laughter. Her cousin Linda was there. Her neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, old friends from her teaching days, and about 25 other family members packed into her modest living room. Margaret tried her best to be the perfect hostess, but every movement sent shooting pain through her injured arm. She kept the makeshift belt sling close to her body, hoping no one would notice her DIY medical solution. The last thing she wanted was to draw attention to her injury or worry anyone about her situation. Then her son David arrived with his wife Sarah. Margaret's heart always did this little flutter when she saw David. He was her only child, her pride and joy, even though things had been strained between them lately. But when Sarah walked in behind him, barely making eye contact and heading straight to the kitchen without even saying hello, Margaret felt that familiar knot in her stomach. The party was going well despite Margaret's discomfort. People were sharing stories, catching up, enjoying the food she'd prepared. But she noticed the looks. Her cousin Linda kept staring at the belt around her arm with concern. Mrs. Peterson whispered something to her husband while glancing in Margaret's direction. The improvised sling was definitely drawing attention. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret struggled more and more. The pain was getting worse, and the belt kept loosening. She tried to adjust it discreetly, but every movement was awkward and painful. Several times, family members offered to help her, but she brushed them off with excuses about arthritis or sleeping wrong. Then came time for the birthday cake. This should have been the highlight of the celebration, Margaret's moment to feel special and loved. But as she reached for the knife to cut the cake, disaster struck. The belt supporting her broken arm completely gave way. Her arm dropped, hanging at an obviously unnatural angle, and she couldn't stop the sharp cry of pain that escaped her lips. The room went completely silent. 25 people all stopped talking at once and stared at Margaret's clearly broken, untreated arm. The gasps were audible. Linda rushed forward, asking what on earth had happened. Mrs. Peterson covered her mouth in horror. Other family members started talking all at once, demanding to know why Margaret hadn't seen a doctor, why her arm was in such terrible condition. Margaret felt overwhelmed, embarrassed, and in tremendous pain. She tried to explain that it wasn't that bad, that she was managing fine, but her voice was shaky and unconvincing. The questions kept coming. When did this happen? How did it happen? Why wasn't she getting proper medical care? That's when David's voice cut through all the chaos and confusion. His tone wasn't concerned or sympathetic like you'd expect from a son seeing his mother in pain. Instead, there was something almost condescending, almost proud in his voice when he said those words that would haunt Margaret forever. "It was my wife. She taught her some lesson." The silence that followed was deafening. Every single person in that room turned to look at Sarah, David's wife, expecting to see shame, embarrassment, maybe an explanation or apology. But what they saw instead was a cold, calculating smirk. Sarah wasn't ashamed of what she'd done. She was pleased that everyone now knew she'd broken an elderly woman's arm. But before anyone could fully process what they'd just heard, before the shock could turn to outrage, Margaret's brother Robert started moving. Robert was a big man, a retired police detective with 30 years on the force, and when he started walking across that room toward David, you could feel the tension spike. His face was a mask of controlled fury, and everyone in the room could sense that something explosive was about to happen. Before I tell you what Robert said that changed everything, make sure you hit that subscribe button because this story gets even more shocking. And let me ask you this. What would you do if you heard someone admit to breaking an elderly family member's arm? Let me know in the comments below. To understand how Margaret ended up broken and helpless at her own birthday party, we need to go back 3 months. That's when her perfect family facade had crumbling, revealing the toxic manipulation that had been destroying her life piece by piece. Margaret had been struggling financially ever since her husband died. His medical bills from the cancer treatments had wiped out their savings, and her small teacher's pension barely covered her basic expenses. The mortgage payments on their family home, the house where she'd raised David, where she'd planned to live out her golden years, were becoming impossible to manage. She'd always been proud and independent. For 40 years, she'd taught elementary school, shaping young minds and earning the respect of her community. She'd raised David as a single mother for several years when his father left, working 2 jobs to make ends meet. She wasn't used to asking for help, especially not from her children. But desperation has a way of breaking down pride. After months of juggling bills, skipping meals, and watching her savings dwindle to nothing, Margaret finally swallowed her pride and called David. Her hands were shaking as she dialed his number, rehearsing what she would say. She just needed help with a few mortgage payments, just enough to get back on her feet. She had a plan to take on tutoring work, maybe sell some of her late husband's things. David's initial response seemed promising. He listened to her explanation, asked about her finances, seemed genuinely concerned about her situation. For a moment, Margaret felt relief flooding through her. Her son would help her. Everything would be okay. But then Sarah got involved. Sarah had always been cold toward Margaret, but it had gotten worse over the past year. What Margaret didn't know was that Sarah had been working systematically to poison David against his mother. It started small. Little comments about how Margaret was too needy, too dramatic, too demanding of David's time. Sarah would roll her eyes when Margaret called, make snide remarks about Margaret's sob stories, and gradually convince David that his mother was manipulative. When David mentioned Margaret's financial problems to Sarah that night, Sarah's reaction was immediate and vicious. "She's manipulating you," Sarah said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Don't you see what she's doing? She's playing the poor widow card to guilt you into supporting her lifestyle. She probably isn't even in real financial trouble. She just wants you to pay for her comfortable retirement." Sarah was relentless in her campaign. She painted Margaret as selfish, as someone who had never really appreciated David, as a mother who was now trying to cash in on years of guilt. She convinced David that helping Margaret would set a dangerous precedent, that his mother would become financially dependent on them forever. But Sarah's manipulation went deeper than just financial concerns. She started isolating David from his mother in more subtle ways. When Margaret would call, Sarah would answer and claim David was busy, then forget to give him the message. When Margaret suggested family dinners, Sarah would agree enthusiastically to David's face, then cancel at the last minute with elaborate excuses about work emergencies or sudden illness. Margaret began to notice that her relationship with David was changing. Their weekly phone calls became bi-weekly, then monthly. The warm conversations they used to have became stilted and brief. When she tried to make plans with him, there was always some reason why it wouldn't work out. She started to feel like she was losing her son, but she couldn't understand why. What Margaret didn't know was that Sarah was also spreading poison throughout the extended family. She would call Margaret's sister-in-law and express concern about Margaret's mental state. She'd suggest that Margaret was becoming bitter and demanding in her old age, that she was trying to guilt the family into supporting her financially. Sarah was careful to present herself as the reasonable, caring daughter-in-law who was just worried about everyone involved. The isolation campaign was devastatingly effective. Family members who had always been close to Margaret started keeping their distance. Invitations to family gatherings became less frequent. When Margaret did attend family events, she felt like people were treating her differently, like they were walking on eggshells around her. Or, worse, like they felt sorry for her. Meanwhile, Margaret's financial situation continued to deteriorate. Without David's help, she was forced to make increasingly desperate choices. She sold her wedding ring, her late husband's tools, family heirlooms that had been passed down for generations. She started shopping at food banks, turned her thermostat down to barely above freezing to save on heating bills, and began rationing her medications to make them last longer. The stress was taking a physical toll on her health. She lost weight, developed insomnia, and started experiencing anxiety attacks. But she was too proud to let anyone know how bad things had gotten, and thanks to Sarah's manipulation, she didn't think anyone would believe her or want to help anyway. 3 weeks before her birthday, Margaret made one last desperate attempt to reconnect with David. She decided to visit him unannounced, hoping that if she could just talk to him face to face, without Sarah's interference, she could explain her situation and maybe repair their relationship. That decision would prove to be the biggest mistake of her life. Margaret took the bus to David and Sarah's upscale neighborhood, using the last of her transportation money. She dressed in her best outfit, trying to look put together despite everything she was going through. When she knocked on their door, David answered with surprise, and what seemed like genuine pleasure at seeing her. But her heart sank when she stepped inside. The house was filled with expensive new furniture, designer decorations, and high-end electronics. Sarah was in the living room arranging fresh flowers in what looked like a very expensive vase. The contrast between their obvious wealth and Margaret's desperate poverty was stark and painful. Margaret tried to be diplomatic, but when Sarah started showing off their latest purchases, a new leather sofa set that cost more than Margaret's monthly pension, artwork that she casually mentioned cost a few thousand, a sound system that David proudly explained was top of the line, Margaret couldn't hide her emotions anymore. The words came out before she could stop them. Must be nice to afford all this while family struggles. It wasn't accusatory, just a sad observation from a woman who had been selling her possessions to buy groceries while her son and daughter-in-law lived in luxury. But Sarah's reaction was explosive and immediate. Her face contorted with rage, and she started screaming about how Margaret was guilt-tripping them, how she was trying to manipulate them with her sob story, how she had no right to comment on their lifestyle choices. The argument escalated quickly. Sarah accused Margaret of being jealous, bitter, and manipulative. She brought up every grievance she'd been storing up for years, every perceived slight or annoyance. Margaret tried to defend herself, tried to explain that she wasn't asking for their money, just their understanding, and maybe some emotional support. That's when Sarah lost complete control. In a moment of pure rage, she shoved Margaret toward the door. Margaret, caught off guard and already unsteady from stress and poor nutrition, lost her balance completely. She fell backward down the 3 steps leading from their front door to the walkway, landing hard on her left arm. The sound of the bone breaking was audible, a sickening crack that both women heard clearly. Margaret lay on the ground, gasping in pain, her arm bent at an unnatural angle. For a moment, even Sarah seemed shocked by what she'd done. But that moment of shock didn't last long. When David's car pulled into the driveway minutes later, Sarah was ready with her story. She claimed that Margaret had become violent and aggressive, that she had tried to attack Sarah, and that she had fallen while lunging at her. Margaret, writhing in pain on the ground, tried to explain what really happened, but Sarah's version was more convincing to David, who was already primed by months of manipulation to distrust his mother. David helped Margaret to her feet, but instead of taking her to the hospital, he drove her home and left her there with her broken arm and Sarah's lies. Margaret spent that night alone, in agony, too proud and too hopeless to call for help. If this story is making you angry, you're not alone. Hit that subscribe button because justice is coming for Sarah, and you won't want to miss it. Here's my question for you. Have you ever seen someone manipulate a family member like this? Share your experiences in the comments. While Margaret suffered in silence with her broken arm and makeshift belt sling, her brother Robert was starting to notice things that didn't add up. Robert hadn't become a successful police detective by ignoring his instincts, and everything about Margaret's situation was setting off alarm bells in his experienced mind. Robert had always been protective of his little sister. Growing up, he was the one who stood up to bullies for her, who walked her home from school, who taught her how to change a tire and balance a checkbook. Even as adults, even after they'd both married and started their own families, Robert kept a watchful eye on Margaret. When her husband died, Robert had been there every step of the way, helping with funeral arrangements, offering financial support, making sure she wasn't completely alone. But over the past few months, Robert had noticed Margaret pulling away from the family. She'd stopped coming to Sunday dinners at his house, stopped calling as frequently, and when she did talk to him, she seemed distant and evasive. He'd attributed it to grief and the normal process of adjusting to widowhood, but now he was beginning to wonder if there was more to it. The first red flag came when Robert called Margaret the week before her birthday to discuss party plans. He'd offered to help with the preparations, maybe even host the party at his larger house. But Margaret had insisted on doing everything herself. What bothered Robert wasn't her independence. He knew Margaret was proud. But the way she sounded on the phone. Her voice was strained and she seemed to be struggling with something physical during their conversation. When Robert asked if everything was okay, Margaret quickly changed the subject. But Robert had spent 30 years reading people, listening for the things they weren't saying, and he knew his sister was hiding something important. 2 days before the party, Robert decided to stop by Margaret's apartment unannounced. What he found there shocked him. Margaret answered the door looking frail and tired, and she was clearly favoring her left arm. When he asked about it, she gave him a vague story about sleeping wrong and having some arthritis pain. But Robert noticed how carefully she moved, how she winced when she thought he wasn't looking, and most concerning of all, the improvised sling she'd made from what looked like an old belt. Robert's detective instincts went into overdrive. In 30 years of police work, he'd seen plenty of people trying to hide injuries, and Margaret's behavior fit the pattern perfectly. The way she avoided using her left arm, the crude homemade sling, her obvious discomfort. This wasn't arthritis or sleeping wrong. This was a serious injury that wasn't being properly treated. When Robert tried to press for more information, Margaret became defensive and evasive. She insisted she was fine, that it wasn't as bad as it looked, that she was managing perfectly well on her own. But Robert could see right through her denials. His sister was in pain, she was hiding a serious injury, and for some reason, she wasn't getting proper medical care. That night, Robert couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen. He started making phone calls to other family members, asking if they'd noticed anything unusual about Margaret lately. What he discovered disturbed him even more. Several relatives mentioned that Margaret seemed different, more withdrawn, less involved in family activities. His sister-in-law mentioned that Sarah had expressed concerns about Margaret's mental state and her increasing demands on David. Robert's instincts told him that Sarah was at the center of whatever was happening to Margaret. He'd never liked David's wife. There was something cold and calculating about her that reminded him of some of the more manipulative criminals he'd encountered in his career. Sarah was the type who could smile to your face while stabbing you in the back, and Robert had always suspected she was trouble. So Robert decided to do what he did best: investigate. He started with Sarah's background, using his contacts in law enforcement to dig into her history. What he found made his blood run cold. Sarah's previous marriage had ended in a messy divorce with allegations of domestic violence. Her ex-husband had filed multiple police reports claiming that Sarah had been physically abusive, but the charges had never stuck. Reading through the reports, Robert saw a pattern of escalating violence and psychological manipulation that was disturbingly familiar. The ex-husband described how Sarah had systematically isolated him from his friends and family, turning everyone against him with lies and manipulation. He talked about how she would provoke arguments and then become physically aggressive when she didn't get her way. Most chilling of all, he described how Sarah would target his elderly mother, spreading rumors about her mental competence and eventually convincing him to cut contact with her entirely. Robert realized he was looking at the blueprint for exactly what was happening to Margaret. Sarah was following the same playbook she'd used to destroy her previous husband's family relationships, and Margaret was her primary target. But Robert knew that his suspicions weren't enough. He needed proof. And he needed it fast. Margaret's birthday party was the next day, and Robert had a feeling that something significant was going to happen there. Sarah had been getting bolder in her attacks on Margaret, and Robert suspected she was building up to something big. That's when Robert remembered the security cameras. Margaret's neighbor, Mrs. Chen, had installed a comprehensive security system after a break-in the previous year. The cameras covered not just her own property, but had a clear view of Margaret's front walkway and steps, exactly where Margaret claimed she'd fallen and injured her arm. Robert visited Mrs. Chen that evening, explaining that he was concerned about his sister's safety and asking if he could review the footage from the day Margaret was injured. Mrs. Chen, who had always been fond of Margaret, was happy to help. What Robert saw on that security footage made him sick to his stomach. The video clearly showed Sarah shoving Margaret down the steps in a moment of pure rage. There was no fall, no accident, no self-defense, just a younger, stronger woman violently attacking an elderly family member. The footage even captured the sound of Margaret's arm breaking and her cries of pain. But what made Robert even angrier was what happened next in the video. He watched Sarah stand over Margaret's broken form for several seconds, not helping, not showing any concern, just looking down at the damage she'd caused. When David's car appeared in the driveway, Robert watched Sarah compose herself, put on a concerned expression, and begin the performance that would convince David that his mother was the aggressor. Robert had his smoking gun, but he faced a difficult decision. His instinct was to immediately call the police and have Sarah arrested for assault. But he knew Margaret would resist that approach. She was too proud, too concerned about protecting David, and too afraid of the medical bills that would come with proper treatment. Instead, Robert decided on a different strategy. He would confront Sarah and David publicly, at Margaret's birthday party, in front of the entire family. He would force them to face the truth about what Sarah had done, and he would make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of person David had chosen to marry. Robert spent the night before the party preparing. He transferred the security footage to his phone, made copies of Sarah's police records from her previous marriage, and gathered all the evidence he needed to expose the truth. He also called his daughter, who was a nurse, and asked her to be ready to provide immediate medical attention to Margaret after the confrontation. The morning of the party, Robert felt like he was preparing for the most important case of his career. This wasn't just about seeking justice for his sister. It was about exposing a dangerous predator who had been systematically destroying his family. Sarah had been operating in the shadows, manipulating and isolating Margaret, while presenting herself as the perfect daughter-in-law to the rest of the family. But Robert knew that predators like Sarah relied on secrecy and shame to maintain their power. Once their actions were exposed to the light, once their victims had support and witnesses, their ability to cause harm was dramatically reduced. As Robert got dressed for the party, he thought about all the cases he'd worked on, where family members had suffered in silence, too ashamed or afraid to speak up about abuse. He thought about the elderly victims he'd encountered, who'd been isolated and manipulated by people they trusted. Margaret wasn't going to become another one of those statistics, not while Robert was alive to protect her. Robert arrived at the party early, ostensibly to help Margaret with the preparations, but really to observe the family dynamics and wait for the right moment to act. He watched Sarah's performance, the way she ignored Margaret, the subtle ways she undermined her, the cold satisfaction in her eyes when she saw Margaret struggling with her injured arm. When Margaret's makeshift sling failed and her broken arm was exposed to the entire family, Robert felt his anger reach a boiling point. But when David made his callous, proud admission about Sarah teaching Margaret a lesson, and when Sarah smirked with satisfaction at the revelation, Robert knew his moment had come. As he started walking across the room toward David, Robert felt the familiar calm that came over him during the most critical moments of his police work. He had the evidence, he had the witnesses, and he had the moral authority to expose the truth. Sarah's reign of terror was about to end. This is where things get really intense. Make sure you're subscribed because you won't believe what Robert says next. And I have to ask, if you had evidence of someone abusing an elderly family member, how would you handle it? Let me know in the comments. The tension in Margaret's living room was so thick, you could cut it with a knife as Robert approached his nephew David. Every family member was watching, sensing that something explosive was about to happen. Margaret stood there clutching her broken arm, tears streaming down her face, while Sarah maintained that cold, satisfied smirk that would soon be wiped off her face forever. Robert stopped directly in front of David, looked him straight in the eye, and said in a voice that carried the authority of 30 years in law enforcement, "Son, we need to talk about what really happened to your mother's arm. And I mean what really happened." David's face immediately flushed with anger and defensiveness. "Don't you dare question my wife, Uncle Robert. You don't know what you're talking about. Mom came to our house looking for money, started a fight with Sarah, and fell down the steps. Sarah was defending herself." The words hung in the air like a lie that everyone could smell. Several family members started murmuring, clearly uncomfortable with David's aggressive tone and the story that didn't quite make sense. How does a 65-year-old woman fall down steps and break her arm so severely that she needs to fashion a sling from a belt? Why wouldn't someone take her to the hospital immediately? Robert pulled out his phone with deliberate calm. "David, I want you to watch something, and I want everyone else here to see this too, because your mother has been suffering in silence for too long." "Robert, please don't," Margaret whispered, but her voice was drowned out by the murmur of curious family members gathering closer. Robert held up his phone so everyone could see the screen. "This is security footage from Mrs. Chen's camera next door. It shows exactly what happened when your mother visited your house 3 weeks ago." The room went completely silent as Robert pressed play. On the small screen, everyone could clearly see Margaret walking up to David and Sarah's front door, knocking and being let inside. The timestamp showed this was 3 weeks earlier during the day. About 10 minutes later, the door opened again, and Margaret emerged, followed closely by Sarah. Even on the small phone screen, you could see that Sarah was agitated, gesturing angrily. Margaret appeared to be trying to leave, walking toward the steps that led down to the sidewalk. Then it happened. Clear as day, in front of 30 shocked family members, they watched Sarah lose control and shove Margaret hard in the back. Margaret, caught completely off guard, tumbled down the 3 concrete steps, landing with a sickening impact on her left arm. The sound of the bone breaking was audible even through the phone's small speaker. The gasps and exclamations from the family were immediate and intense. Margaret's cousin Linda covered her mouth in horror. Mrs. Peterson started crying. Several of the men in the room made sounds of disgust and outrage. But the video wasn't over. They watched Sarah stand over Margaret's broken form for several seconds, not helping, not showing any concern or remorse. Margaret was clearly in agony, crying out in pain, trying to cradle her obviously broken arm, and Sarah just stood there, watching. When David's car pulled into the driveway on the video, everyone watched Sarah quickly compose herself, put on a concerned expression, and begin her performance of the innocent victim defending herself from an aggressive elderly woman. The silence that followed was deafening. 30 pairs of eyes turned to look at Sarah, whose smirk had completely disappeared. Her face had gone pale, and for the first time since anyone had known her, she looked genuinely afraid. David's reaction was initially one of denial and confusion. That There has to be some explanation. Sarah said Mom attacked her first. This video doesn't show everything. But Robert wasn't finished. Oh, this video shows plenty, David. It shows your wife deliberately and violently assaulting your 65-year-old mother. It shows her breaking your mother's arm and then standing there watching her suffer. And it shows her preparing to lie to you about what happened. Sarah finally found her voice, but it came out as a desperate, panicked screech. She came to our house demanding money. She was trying to make David feel guilty. She attacked me first. The camera just didn't catch that part. But her lies were falling apart in real time. Margaret's cousin Linda, who had been quiet up until now, spoke up with a voice shaking with anger. Sarah, I've known Margaret my entire life. She's never been violent with anyone. She taught elementary school for 40 years. She dedicated her life to helping children. The idea that she would attack anyone is absolutely ridiculous. Other family members started chiming in with their own observations. Mrs. Peterson mentioned how Sarah had always seemed cold toward Margaret. David's own cousin pointed out how Sarah had been systematically excluding Margaret from family events over the past year. The pattern of isolation and manipulation was becoming clear to everyone in the room. But Robert still wasn't done. He had more evidence to share, and he was going to make sure everyone understood exactly what kind of person Sarah really was. There's something else everyone needs to know about Sarah, Robert announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. This isn't the first time she's done something like this. He pulled up another document on his phone, police reports from Sarah's previous marriage. Sarah's first husband filed multiple domestic violence reports against her. He described a pattern of physical abuse and psychological manipulation that's exactly what we've been seeing here with Margaret. Sarah's face went from pale to red as she realized her past was being exposed to David's entire family. Those were lies. My ex-husband was trying to destroy me in the divorce. Those charges were dropped. The charges were dropped because you're good at manipulating people and covering your tracks, Robert replied coldly. But the pattern is clear. You target the elderly family members first. You isolate your spouse from their support system. You use violence when manipulation doesn't work. And you always have a sob story ready to explain away your behavior. David was starting to look sick as the pieces fell into place. The past year of his mother's withdrawal from the family, Sarah's constant complaints about Margaret, the gradual erosion of his relationship with his mother. It was all starting to make horrible sense. David, his cousin Mike said gently, think about it. When was the last time you talked to your mom without Sarah being involved somehow? When was the last time you saw her without Sarah making some comment about how needy or manipulative she was being? David's hands were shaking as he processed what everyone was telling him. Memories were flooding back. All the times Sarah had answered Margaret's calls and forgotten to give him the message. All the family events that got canceled at the last minute because of Sarah's sudden emergencies. All the subtle ways Sarah had been poisoning his perception of his mother. Oh my God, David whispered, looking at Margaret with dawning horror. Mom, what have I done to you? But Sarah wasn't going down without a fight. Cornered and exposed, she revealed her true nature with a viciousness that shocked even Robert, who had seen plenty of criminals in his time. You want to know the truth? Sarah screamed, her voice rising to a pitch that made several family members step back. Yes, I pushed her. And I'm glad I did. She was trying to ruin my marriage. She was constantly calling David, constantly trying to make him feel guilty about her pathetic financial situation. The room erupted in shocked exclamations, but Sarah kept going, her mask completely off now. She came to our house that day, acting like some tragic victim, making comments about our furniture, trying to guilt David into giving her money. She needed to learn that I'm his wife now, not her. She needed to learn her place. The silence that followed Sarah's outburst was filled with such tension and disgust that it felt like the air itself was poisoned. Margaret was sobbing quietly, not from physical pain, but from the emotional devastation of hearing such hatred directed at her by someone she'd tried so hard to build a relationship with. David looked like he was going to be sick. His face had gone completely white, and he was staring at his wife like he was seeing her for the first time. "Sarah, how could you? She's my mother. She's a 65-year-old woman who just lost her husband. How could you hurt her like that?" But Sarah was beyond reason now. Years of carefully maintained manipulation had crumbled in a matter of minutes, and her true personality was on full display. "Your mother is a manipulative old woman who was trying to come between us. Everything I did was to protect our marriage." That's when Margaret's neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, a gentle woman in her 70s, who had never raised her voice in her life, stepped forward and slapped Sarah across the face with a sound that echoed through the apartment. "You evil, wicked woman," Mrs. Peterson said, her voice shaking with righteous anger. Margaret spent 40 years teaching children, helping families, and building this community. She took care of her dying husband for 2 years without a single complaint. "She's one of the kindest, most generous people I've ever known. And you're a monster." The slap seemed to snap something in the room. Several family members started talking at once, expressing their outrage and disgust. David's cousin Mike moved protectively closer to Margaret. Linda was on her phone, clearly calling someone, probably the police or an ambulance. David finally found his voice, and when he spoke, it was with a broken whisper that carried more weight than any shout. "Sarah, get out. Get out of my mother's house. Get out of my life. I never want to see you again." But Sarah's response revealed just how deeply her narcissism ran. Instead of showing any remorse or attempting to apologize, she laughed. "Actually, I laughed. You'll be back, David. You'll realize that I was right about her, and when you do, don't come crawling back to me." As she headed toward the door, Sarah turned back for one final vicious parting shot. "Enjoy taking care of your pathetic mother, David. I hope you're happy living in poverty with her." The door slammed behind her, leaving a room full of people in stunned silence. Margaret was still crying. David looked like his world had just collapsed, and everyone else was processing what they'd just witnessed. "I know this is intense, but stay with me because justice is just getting started." Make sure you're subscribed for the conclusion. My question for you is, have you ever seen someone's true nature revealed like this? Tell me about it in the comments. The silence following Sarah's explosive exit was deafening. David stood frozen, staring at the slammed door while Margaret sobbed quietly, overwhelmed by pain and the devastation of her family being torn apart. Robert immediately called 911. "This is retired Detective Morrison. I need police and paramedics at 1247 Oak Street. We have an assault victim and a suspect who just fled." David rushed to his mother's side, tears streaming. "Mom, I'm so sorry. How could I have been so blind? How could I have chosen her over you?" Margaret looked up with eyes full of pain. "David, I tried to tell you so many times what she was doing to our family. I failed you completely. I let her poison me against you." David replied, his voice raw with guilt. The paramedics arrived quickly. Jennifer, the lead paramedic, examined Margaret's makeshift belt sling with concern. "How long have you had this broken arm?" she asked. "About 3 weeks, Margaret admitted quietly. 3 weeks? This should have been treated immediately. Why didn't you seek medical care?" "I couldn't afford it and had no one to ask for help," Margaret said through fresh tears. Officer Martinez reviewed the security footage grimly. "Clear assault on an elderly person. We're issuing an arrest warrant immediately." As paramedics prepared Margaret for transport, she grabbed David's hand. "I forgive you. You were manipulated. I never stopped loving you." David broke down completely at her words of forgiveness. At the hospital, X-rays revealed Margaret's arm was broken in multiple places and had begun healing incorrectly. She needed immediate surgery. 3 days later, Sarah was arrested. Faced with overwhelming evidence, she pleaded guilty to felony assault on an elderly person and was sentenced to 2 years in prison. David threw himself into caring for his mother during recovery. He paid off her mortgage and provided financial security while they rebuilt their relationship through months of healing conversations. A year later, Margaret celebrated her 66th birthday, surrounded by genuine family love. Standing to address the group, her arm fully healed, she spoke with newfound strength. "A year ago, I thought my family was lost forever. But I learned that sometimes families must be broken apart before they can heal properly. Real love means protecting each other from those who want to hurt us. David embraced his mother as their family applauded their courage to rebuild after betrayal. Robert raised his glass in toast to Margaret, who survived and came back stronger. This is what real family looks like. Margaret pulled Robert aside later. You saved my life. You saved yourself, Robert replied. You survived with dignity and never lost your capacity for love. Margaret smiled peacefully. I'm not afraid anymore. Sarah tried to break me, but instead she made me stronger. Looking around at her true family, Margaret realized that sometimes the worst experiences can lead to the best outcomes. Her 65th birthday had been a day of pain, but it became the beginning of her journey back to herself and to the family that truly loved her. The final image. Margaret at 66, healthy and confident, no longer wearing a makeshift sling, but the smile of a woman who had reclaimed her life from someone who tried to destroy it.